Hello, everyone. I'm excited to introduce you to our live webinar, Satisfying the Banking Appetite. My name is Ashraf Shanab, and I'm the EMEA Commercial Director here at RFI Group. Before we get started, I'd like to share a little more about RFI Group. I, of course, appreciate some of you might be familiar with us, but for those of you who are not, at RFI, we specialize in data and information gathering, insight generation, and business decision support for the world's leading financial services providers. And we consistently provide clients like yourselves with tailored insights based on their specific market and business needs. Our speaker for today, Luke Olchin, will join us shortly. Please remember, while we want this to be an informative and interactive session, we also really welcome your questions. So please start posting those throughout the presentation or the session, the webinar today. And we will make sure that we leave some time at the end to answer those. Use the chat function in your control panel to post those. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome. Thank you for joining. Luke Olchin, our research director, will be kicking us off in just a minute. He'll walk us through the agenda and then the insights. But as someone who frequently explores upcoming trends and insights at RFI Group and has his fingers on the pulse, he's best placed to help RFI clients foresee opportunities emerging within the world of digital, as well as threats. I'll be seeing you shortly, but for now, I'd like to introduce you to your presenter of the day, RFI Group's Research Director, Luke Olchin. Over to you, Luke.
Thanks, Ash, and hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. So my name is Luke Olchin, and I'm the Research Director at RFI Group. And for the next 25 minutes or so, I'll be walking you through some of the latest findings from a global digital banking study, sharing some of my own thoughts around the future of mobile banking. The plan will be to answer some of these sort of key questions as to what exactly makes a good mobile app. And who is winning that mobile app battle, and what does innovation, what does it really mean? As Ash mentioned, there will be a Q&A session at the end of this presentation, at the end of this webinar. So in the meantime, please feel free to add your questions into the chat, and we'll get to them later on. So just kicking things off, looking at what is that, how can you optimize that user experience? So where does mobile banking fit within the consumer's day-to-day banking? What makes a good mobile banking experience? And why is this question becoming ever more important? So for most consumers today, digital banking sits at the heart of their banking needs. While internet banking continues to play a crucial role, we are beginning to see this transition towards mobile banking. Monthly usage, while highest for internet banking, is on a slight downward trend, while mobile banking, on the other hand, has experienced quite a sharp rise in that monthly usage. Other channels, such as branch, for example, took a bit of a hit following the initial lockdown off the back of the pandemic, and it hasn't yet bounced back. Many people have been asking as to when will it begin to bounce back, or will it bounce back? And so why it's undeniable that the pandemic itself has a profound effect in terms of driving that digital banking usage, as well as more specifically mobile banking. It's not just in terms of frequency usage, but also the adoption that we're seeing this effect. There are many consumers in the market now who are completely new to mobile banking. And when we've asked those consumers about what their intentions are regarding internet banking, regarding mobile banking in the future, we see most of them say that they will continue using mobile banking at a sort of similar rate as they are right now. And with that, even the majority of these consumers also say they intend to maybe increase their usage even further. So I think what this does is this really just highlights that the changes that we've seen in channel usage over the last 18 or so months, I think it's fair to say they're probably here to stay. Again, and this is also reflected again in terms of channel preference. So while consumers' channel usage was forced towards digital and mobile due to the many different lockdowns, restrictions that we've seen around the world, Preference itself remained unrestricted. So while preference is steadily decreasing across most of these channels, we're seeing that preference towards mobile banking is rising quite sharply here as well. So across a number of different markets as well, so in that sort of the table on the bottom there as well, we can see that across a number of these global markets compared to 12 months ago, mobile banking is now sitting as that number one, or that taking that top spot in terms of consumers' preference towards their digital banking channels. And so this is very much true across all ages. So consumers across all ages are feeling increasingly familiar with carrying out their banking via the mobile banking apps, and many now do so and do all of their banking via their smartphone. And it remains mostly true across these generations as well. So among those Gen Z, millennials and Gen X, mobile is the most preferred and the most used channel. Baby boomers, on the other hand, is still, they're the exception. While we have seen usage and preference towards mobile has been increasing, they still very much sort of favour internet banking, and this is mostly in favour of the biggest screen. So in terms of a good channel experience, it's always been an important part of the overall banking experience. But we have seen the importance of channels grow over the last 18 or so months. And again, it's the mobile that has seen the greatest shift in terms of importance. So the way in which to sort of look at this chart here, from sort of left to right, shows how important it is to driving that overall customer satisfaction, the overall customer experience. And the arrows itself are just reflecting that change that we've seen since 12 months ago. So yes, all channels themselves are shifting more to the right and growing in importance, but it's in fact it's that mobile which has seen the biggest shift, the biggest growth in terms of its importance to driving that overall customer satisfaction. And while it's true that the branch still remains as a pivotal for driving that satisfaction, and it can be seen as maybe being the very definition of customer service, as mobile banking usage grows and while branch usage dwindles, this is likely to change. So we know that a good app experience can drive that customer satisfaction, but what exactly makes a good app experience? So there are many things to consider, of which many still remain applicable across all digital channels. So namely security, which I'll touch upon a little bit later on in this webinar. But essentially, when it comes to mobile banking sort of experience and satisfaction, it's very much underpinned by the speed and the ease of usage, and that's really what underpins that good mobile banking experience. I also want to just draw your attention to those attributes that are highlighted in the orange as well. So these are some of the ones which consumers tend to be less satisfied about, and also some things that are still relatively important in terms of driving that overall satisfaction score. And we see it's the range of tasks as well as the ability to access information they need as being 2 points which are essentially pain points within the market. So while it's important to maintain and ensure ease and speed within the app, these two attributes here should also still sit quite high up in terms of that priority list. Interestingly though, I think it's very much become a bit of a balancing act for most of these mobile banking app providers. So while consumers want to see more features added to the mobile apps, allowing them to conduct more of their banking, more of their day-to-day banking via mobile, it's also important that this doesn't impair the app's simplicity. So some consumers also cited as a lack of innovation as being one of the sort of pain points, or something which is driving their dissatisfaction. But again, this doesn't always mean adding new features. Innovation is essentially about making consumers' lives a little bit easier. So it's like simplicity and like intuitive navigation. This is what can really give an app the edge. So what's the use of a new feature if it's hard to either find or locate, or if it's also difficult to use. So moving on now a little bit about that was very much like the landscape of what's going on in mobile banking, and what is some of the key things that are important to consider in terms of who's winning the mobile banking battle, let's say. I'm sure it comes to no surprise to you when I say that fintechs itself continue to establish themselves within the banking markets. Usage has continued to grow over time, and while China and India and a number of these other Asian markets are the real driving force behind that global increase, we still see in a number of these Western markets, so just focus on the UK here, for example, we're still seeing almost a third of consumers having used a fintech provider in the past. In terms of some of the providers that have been using, say Monzo itself still sits there at the top, still sort of one of the more established fintech providers in this market, and it's remained steady. But in addition to that, we've also got Klarna as well. So this is one of the more sort of newer players within the market. So from working in that buy now pay later space, which again has got another sort of another very interesting aspect, which is coupled a little bit with sort of the whole idea of banking via mobile. But maybe it's something for another time, maybe. In terms of the user experience and some of the reasons why someone may choose to use a fintech provider as opposed to using a more traditional provider, we see that it always comes back down to that ease of use. Historically, when sort of 2 or so years ago, when fintechs were still sort of very much sort of trying to establish themselves in the market, they were seen as being more sort of like either cost effective, low cost, or good for saving money. Whereas now it's very much driven by that ease of use, as well as some other attributes here as well. The idea of it saves them time, easy applications, and more recently now the idea that it provides them with greater benefits. I think one last thing as well is also quite interesting just to draw a note to as well is in the green. So it's it helps me make better financial decisions. I think when fintechs first sort of started entering the market, you saw one of the sort of main parts of their app, or like their proposition, or made them differentiate themselves from the other providers in the market, was a lot of the sort of the PFM tools, the spending categorizations, these attributes which were there to, or these features that were there to try and help consumers manage their finances. However, I think over time, we've seen a number of the more established incumbent banks have began introducing these types of features to their apps as well. So as a differentiator, it's no longer up there at the top of the list in terms of what is really driving a consumer to choose to use a fintech rather than one of the more traditional incumbent banks. Focusing a little bit in terms of the satisfaction as well, I think this is also quite interesting as well. So historically, or even now, there's still this very much perception that the service you get via fintech is it's more innovative, it's it's a better service. But when you look in terms of the levels of satisfaction among the customers, we see it now is very much, it's quite a level, or even level playing field really. Consumers who are using a traditional provider or an incumbent bank as their main bank tend to be equally as satisfied as those who are choosing to use a fintech provider. So I think what this does, it just reflects the efforts that have been made by financial institutions across the board. So not just the fintechs in terms of trying to increase their functionality. We're also seeing these more incumbent banks are increasing the functionality, making the apps a bit more cleaner, a bit more intuitive, a bit more streamlined. And that's just reflected here. Consumers themselves, in terms of level of satisfaction, it's very, very much a level playing field between the fintechs and those incumbent banks. So while the fintechs themselves are considered to be the more innovative of the two, appreciating the ease of use and the fact that everything can be done online. So yeah, the main things of which consumers find most appealing, or things that they like the most about their fintech, again, it's ease of use, speed as well, and specifically about the idea of being able to do everything online. So this is quite an interesting one as well, because while we have seen a number of banks now have begun to increase the functionality within their apps and online, and are now enabling consumers to essentially do all of their day-to-day banking digitally, what we find is that it's still a bit of a legacy there in terms of consumers' understanding of what's available and what they can do online. Fintechs themselves has the edge in this sense because they've never had that physical presence or a physical branch. It's just assumed by the users and by the consumers that yes, I'll be able to do everything I need to do within the app. Whereas I think among some of the users and customers of these traditional incumbent banks, Sometimes they still rely on branch. And while sometimes it may be down to their preference, in some instances, it's because they're not fully aware that they can conduct that task online. So it comes down to a bit of an education piece, and not just about educating people around the new and latest features that have been added to the particular app. Because you've got to bear in mind that a number of these mobile banking app users over the last 18 months are new to mobile banking. So even some of the more simpler tasks, such as setting up a direct debit or a stand order, these sort of tasks which we may take as granted as being very sort of simplistic and easy to follow and easy to use, for some of these older consumers or some of the consumers who have not previously conducted their banking digitally or via mobile, they may still need a little bit of assistance in terms of navigating and finding their way to that particular journey, and then also some support in terms of completing that journey. So in terms of how banks are competing, in terms of the bank versus fintechs, or how can banks essentially compete with the fintechs? So these are just a number of some of the sort of features that consumers will find appealing. So in terms of what is found most appealing, of something which I think is probably going to be a main part, or at least a key part of the future, is around that sort of account aggregation. So it's the idea of being able to view all your accounts within one single place. I really very believe that this is the way forward, and I think it's something that we're going to see materialise in the coming years. We also see as well sort of spending categorisation tools, as well as new saving tools and PFM tools. So again, that idea of being able to help them manage their finances and make better financial decisions. These are also features and attributes that customers say they find appealing. And it sort of mostly remains true across those different age groups as well. So some of the younger consumers are more leaning towards those spending categorizations and other sort of ways of helping them manage their spending, whilst the older consumers are leaning more towards the account aggregation. Although this probably just reflects the number of accounts or number of banking relationships these consumers are likely to have. The young consumers are more likely to be spending more and maybe only have one or two providers, and some of the older consumers may have more relationships. So therefore, there's a greater need for account aggregation. But as mentioned previously, again, innovation isn't just about adding new features. While the information just shared on that previous slide highlighted a few of these some of these new and exciting features that possibly could be brought to banking, to mobile banking. Essentially, innovation is about making it just a little bit simpler for consumers, making their data-to-day banking a little bit easier and a little bit more intuitive and a little bit more streamlined. So in terms of some of the features that consumers will find most appealing, of things they want to see added to their mobile banking apps, we see here stuff like quick view balance, transferring money to contacts using their account, using their account data, or possibly transferring money via a mobile number. These sort of things, while they're not cutting edge or in terms of like innovation, and they've been around for a number of years, these are still some of these attributes, some of these features that consumers are still hoping to be able to see or see added to their mobile banking app. So again, it just reflects that it's not about the latest sort of introducing the latest technologies. Some of the more simplistic sort of attributes or features will go a long way. And moving on in terms of, so coming back a little bit in terms of the some of the account aggregation, but also some of these other sort of features. Innovation is about making that customer journey, that customer experience a little bit easier. And across a number of these markets now, open banking in Europe, you've got the PSD2. Essentially, it's been now here for a number of years, and we're beginning to see as well expand across more and more markets. And this is something which I think is something that needs to be embraced by financial institutions across the globe. It's essentially would be the future. We see that the number of individuals who are interested in terms of sharing their personal information in order to gain the benefits that open banking can bring, it's continuing to increase. It now sits around 1 in 3 in 10 consumers say they will be interested in sharing their personal information. In terms of some of the features that they would like to see in return, again, the idea of the account aggregation, so being able to see all accounts in one place. This is the one that comes up most strongly. But it's also worth just mentioning as well, again, in terms of the appeal of these different services that open banking will enable. it is steadily increasing across the board. But again, I think trust itself will remain essentially key and crucial within this customer journey itself. And again, the long-standing, those more established, those incumbent banks themselves are better positioned in terms of from a trust perspective. Whereas you see some of those new and emerging fintech companies or some of those technology companies are sitting much further down the list and on the far left side in terms of consumers' trust. So trust is always going to be quite important. It's, especially when it's getting someone to use a new service or a new feature, or enabling a sharing their information, personal information, with other providers. So open banking, some may see it as a bit of a threat to them in terms of whether it's another opportunity for fintechs to excel. But in reality, banks themselves are better positioned to provide these such services because the consumer trust lies with them. And again, this just reflects that. So in terms of some of the reasons why consumers may be uncomfortable or not willing to use a fintech provider, it really much just comes down to not knowing enough about them, and that preference towards more established providers, security concerns, as well as trust. So while trust is still in the favour of those established banks and established brands, it won't be like that forever. As some of these fintech providers begin to establish themselves, and as time goes on, consumers themselves be more aware and more familiar with these brands, and that may essentially begin to shift the tide. And then finally, just touching upon some of those security concerns as well. So we mentioned that, in terms of what drives a good mobile banking app experience, a good digital experience, what's important to driving that satisfaction, yes, ease of use and speed is going to be key, but security is still very much important, especially amongst maybe some of those consumers who are new to digital or new to mobile, or those who are beginning to conduct more of their banking on mobile apps, trying new tasks, doing things they haven't done previously. There will still be concerns around security. So this, while consumers themselves say they're, one of the main reasons why they won't be using a mobile banking app is because they're happy with their current methods, we see there in second place that security concerns. And this is, it appears across all of those markets there, with the exception of Singapore, but across most of those markets, we're seeing security as being, within that top 3 barriers to mobile banking adoption, but also just increasing the usage and the frequency of usage among those current users. So some of the ways in which maybe a bank or financial institution could try to encourage consumers to use mobile banking apps, again, it's very much those reluctant users. It still very much is underpinned by the sense of security. They want to know that their money is kept safe. They want to know that they're going to be safe from fraud. So naturally, one of those sort of key things that is coming up quite strongly here, that could be a way of showing these reluctant consumers that they will be safe, that the bank is looking out for them, relates to fraud alerts. There's also, in addition to that as well, the idea of they're just being reiterating that there is guarantees are in place, so they will be compensated if they were to experience fraud of one type or another. And then sort of lastly here, just looking at sort of that comparison between online banking and mobile banking. So while we are seeing mobile banking increasing and usage of the internet and online banking decreasing, one of those sort of key barriers I think which will hinder getting those users across onto mobile banking, again, it very much strongly sits with that security aspect as well. So consumers typically would see the online banking as being more secure than the mobile banking services. So that sort of concludes the slides. I just want to run through maybe a few of the sort of key takeaways here. So effectively, we know that mobile banking usage is continuing to rise, and it's rapidly becoming a #1 channel of choice among the consumers. As mentioned, it's still very much a bit of a balancing act right now for the mobile app providers. They've got to get the right balance between providing new features to their customers, meeting their customer demand in terms of the growing need to conduct more of their banking tasks via the app, but also bearing in mind that it can't impair the simplicity or the ease of use of the app as well. So it's about finding the right balance. And again, innovation, as mentioned, it goes beyond just adding new features or adding the latest technologies to the service. Ultimately, it's about making the customer's life that little bit simpler. So it's not about just introducing the latest technology. In some ways, it's just about simplifying some of the existing tasks, working on an intuitive navigation, and also just supporting some of these customers or some of the consumers who are still relatively new to either digital banking or relatively new to the mobile banking app. And finally, just touching upon open banking again, it has the potential to really revolutionise mobile banking experience, and it's a trust that will be key. As mentioned, in terms of one of the most exciting things that open banking brings to the table is that account aggregation. So what we may see over time is as consumers become more used to using an aggregated service, the idea of it being like the main bank may no longer be as important as being that main app. So it's just something to bear in mind. Mobile banking is important right now. It's growing in importance, and pending what happens off the back of open banking and how account aggregation evolves, it will only grow ever more important. And that concludes the slides.
Thank you very much, Luke. It's very interesting to see those insights being explored further, especially when looking at the historical trends, the view at this point in time, and also in combination with the consumer preference and the future intentions. I think between the three, we can really draw some strong conclusions here. And one of the, there are a few things I'd like to comment on, but I actually want to open it for questions. I just want to remind everybody that you could post your questions through the chat function in your control panel. We will try to answer those. And whilst we get some questions, Luke, I can't wait to ask you a few questions myself. So maybe we'll start by thinking about mobile banking. And I know that there were some really interesting insights there about how globally mobile preference is on the up. It's increasing. That's a very clear trend that we're seeing, and it's across all ages with the exception of baby boomers. But also that slide about the importance of channels, and how much the big shift that mobile banking has made over the last 12 months in terms of importance. I guess my question here is, based on all of that, and based on the fact that branch remains to be important, that omni-channel aspect is highlighted in your presentation remains to be important. Do you at all see a complete shift, at least in the digital banking side of things, to mobile banking over the next 5 years or so, for instance?
I think so, to varying degrees. I think among some of the younger generations and some of the young consumers, I very much believe that possibly the importance of branch will continue to decrease. It's also hard to say, because in terms of the types of tasks that people conduct via digital channels versus the branch and those physical channels, it is quite varied. From a day-to-day banking aspect, yes, I think we saw here that a third of consumers now say that they are using the mobile app for all of their banking or all of their day-to-day banking, but still there are still elements among those younger consumers that will still possibly drive them towards going into branch. So, for example, if someone who's in the late 20s, early 30s and looking to take out a mortgage, they haven't done this task before. So it's all still relatively new, and in those instances, they may still require assistance, and they may still prefer to go into branch. But it comes down to that idea of, when I was talking through one of the slides, there's a quadrant slide that looked at some of the drivers of how can you drive satisfaction among mobile banking. And one of those key pain points was around access to information, or finding the information you need. So in some instances, unless that sort of point is addressed, there will still be some of these more complex tasks. Some of these tasks which you only ever do a handful of times in your lifetime, such as taking out a mortgage. If the information is not readily available, if it's difficult to get hold of this information, then yeah, it will still revert back to branch. But it's something I can see over time. Yeah, it will become an instance where they may initially start to try and see what's available via the mobile before resorting to branch.
Thank you, Luke. And on the topic of those pain points that you mentioned earlier, and I think we've highlighted that the range of tasks is one, the access to information is another. There are loads for banks and fintechs to think, loads of features for them to think about. How can they prioritize? What features should they prioritize in order to deliver that satisfaction?
Yeah, so I think it's a point I made several times during the past 25 minutes. It all comes back down to innovation is not the latest technologies or the newest features. Sometimes it just comes back down to simplicity. So in first instance, they should be prioritizing and ensuring that the more regular, the more frequently conducted tasks that people do via mobile banking, such as when setting up direct debits, transferring money, looking at balances, are these customer journeys as streamlined or as simplistic or as clean or as intuitive as they possibly can be? I think that is the first point of call. Beyond that, then we can start looking at adding in more features and sort of trying to expand. But again, I think expanding into new features and bringing new stuff in is always going to complicate the formula. But ultimately, it just comes down to making that day-to-day banking as easy as possible. So yeah, PFM tools themselves, as I was saying, that's discussed quite frequently, and it's saying that's the fintechs really sort of use that as a bit of an anchor for them. But it's whether these consumers need all of those different. Some of them are very comprehensive where they need all of those features. It's about, again, you can't trade off the simplicity and they have a clean looking app for more features. You've got to bear in mind. It's got to be a good balancing act between the two.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Luke. Looking at satisfaction in mobile apps or mobile banking for both traditional and fintechs, there isn't a clear winner, right? At least from the data that we've seen today. Is this about the user experience that's being provided? Is it about the trust? Is it about the range of products and what that's being offered? And what do they have to do either side to differentiate themselves? So what do incumbent banks or traditional banks, or what do fintechs need to do in order to differentiate themselves?
Yeah, sure. I think one thing as well is worth bearing in mind and not to be overlooked is when you compare the customer base of fintechs against some of the more traditional incumbent banks, we see that there is a difference there. Fintechs themselves have a greater proportion of the younger millennials and Gen Zs within their customer base, and it comes down to just ensuring that the features and the look and feel of the app is aligned to that. So when we see satisfaction among some of the incumbent banks, like, yeah, sure, they don't have the same, maybe not to the functionality to the same degree as some of these fintechs, but again, when it comes down to a lot of day-to-day banking needs, as long as the customer needs are being met and it's being done in a very sort of simplistic way, it's going to deliver a good experience. From a fintech perspective, again, I'm using say Monzo as an example. So I myself was a Monzo customer from the very beginning. I think back then they were called, was it Mondo? I think before Monzo. Again, the app itself was revolutionary in terms of what it could do, the way it looked. It was very intuitive. But I have found over the years my usage of the Monzo app has began to diminish. I think they're really sort of struggling in some ways around the app itself doesn't look as clean. I find it has become a little bit more cluttered. So I think for some of the fintechs, it really is just they've got to take a step back and really maybe just prioritize the most important features. And it's still great having these additional features, but maybe have some of them hidden behind some menus. Or one thing we're seeing across online internet banking, you would have like a side menu bar which remains up at all time, which is enabling that quick navigation, but it's making the main screen itself just a little bit cleaner. So I think that's probably one of the main things for the fintechs to think about, is just how can they improve navigation and maybe make that sort of landing screen or that initial sort of main screen that they use and just look a little bit more less cluttered and a little bit more cleaner. In terms of the incumbent banks, a little bit of the opposite as well. I think some instances they do need to look at adding some new additional features. It really just comes down to assessing what tasks consumers want to do, but in a lot of cases it comes down to education, making it clear to the consumers what can be done via the mobile app or via the digital channels. So we have seen a number of different features being added to their digital banking services, but whether the consumers are fully aware of this is still a bit unknown in some cases. As mentioned, it's not just a case about highlighting the latest or the newest features they've added, but just highlighting some of these existing features that have been around for a number of years, bearing in mind that a proportion of these mobile banking customers are now new to mobile banking. While a particular customer journey has been, for example, depositing a check via a mobile app has been around for a number of years. If you say you've got an older consumer who has never used mobile banking before, they may not be able to make this the link that this can be done by mobile. They'll still see it as being a physical check, so I have to go into branch to deposit it. So yes, in some cases it's just around making it clear what can be done, which again will address that pain point around the idea of the range of tasks that can be conducted via mobile banking. If you look at it from a incumbent bank perspective, some of these tasks that consumers are talking about they want to have added, some of them already exist, but they just may not know about it.
Thank you, Luke. I have a question on accessibility here, and it defines it by saying making them usable by all people independently of their abilities. That accessibility element has not been mentioned in today's presentation, and although it may have been covered in the user experience area, are there any trends or gaps in accessibility for major banks versus fintechs? Is accessibility impending adoption of mobile banking apps?
Maybe one for another time. I say in terms of what banks are doing, I think it's a very, very difficult one, I think, to address based on, because when you talk about accessibility and look at some of these some disabilities that consumers may be, or challenges that some consumers may be facing, the needs are very, very, very varied. And I think, it always will be a bit of a challenge based on the needs of those individuals. Again, it's whether especially when you start looking at it from a physical perspective of the individual, unless they've got support from someone else, it may be very challenging for them to make that transition across onto the mobile banking app. That's where branch will be involved. So even if someone has some challenges, there'll be someone in branch to support them. Essentially, mobile banking is self-service, and that's it always will be a challenge, I think, for some of these individuals.
Thank you, Luke. We've got a number of questions. Sorry, but I'm going to try and. So there's a question on regulations around fintech in Australia and Canada. I think that's a topic that we don't really cover in today's webinar, but we can always support on it later. And then another one on, I know that the UAE wasn't in our covered in the slides today, but are you aware of any particular fintech applications or trends that you want to highlight to us in today's session?
Yeah, sure. I guess the UAE is one of those markets which historically has been very much driven by when you look at how consumers spend and how people do conduct their banking. It is still very much focused. Cash is still an important part of that market. They still have a preference towards branch. Obviously, a good digital banking experience is key to them, as just as important as many other markets. But they still have this very much element. They enjoy that branch experience. They enjoy sort of going in and being serviced face to face. In terms of some of the apps themselves, we have seen some good innovations coming from the UAE. I think the Live app, which was introduced a number of years ago, was very, very good. It's quite revolutionary in terms of it's going expanding beyond just a banking app. It becomes more of a lifestyle app, incorporating different elements of consumers' lives into a single location. So again, I mentioned how account aggregation is going to be important, and the importance of APIs in terms of how it may revolutionize mobile banking. But it's not just about bringing in different bank accounts into a single view. Some banks and some providers are going a little step further and bringing in aspects of customers' lives outside of banking into the same app, which again will only drive usage, will drive engagement. And when you talk about what could be in the future, as opposed to talking about the main bank, we'll be talking about that main app. If an app is allowing them to do more than just banking, it's going to be better positioned at capturing and securing that main app status.
Thank you, Luke. Really interesting insight, and thanks for that. I know I've got a couple more questions before we wrap up. So one of them is really interesting. The question here is around considering that popularity of digital banking is clearly on the rise, and there's a clear upward trend here. Do you think that traditional banks will be able to keep up with digital banks?
I can't see why not. Talking from my personal experience of the different apps being provided by some of those incumbent banks here in the UK. So I myself, over the last 5 years, I've probably banked with about 5 or 6 different incumbent banks, as well as a number of fintechs. And I can honestly say the experience that I get from those apps are, let's say, essentially on par with the fintechs. But it all comes down again to the customer needs. I may see myself as being a bit more of a simplistic, easygoing sort of a mobile banking user or customer. My banking needs are quite simplistic when it comes to that financial management aspect of it all. I'm quite easygoing from that, so that's not a particular thing I require. But in terms of putting out Halifax, for example, and Lloyd's app, I think out of all the ones I've tried, I think it's one of the ones that to me just felt easy. It felt so intuitive, and it was just quite clean. So yeah, I think we saw in terms of the levels of satisfaction among those who are using a mobile app with a main bank, a traditional bank, versus those who are using the mobile app with a fintech. Essentially, it is on par. Obviously, it varies across different markets, and some may have a little bit, slightly further to go in terms of getting their banking app to the same level as a fintech. But here in the UK, digital banking, mobile banking, it's very much becoming a bit of a hygiene factor. It can almost be assumed that the experience you'll get by mobile banking is going to be, very good.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Luke. We are out of time, so I'll take one more question. I will apologize to everyone. We have a lot of questions and no time to answer, but we will follow up with you in due course. And one final question to you, Luke. We've seen many data breaches, especially in the headlines, coming, especially around mobile banking and fintech apps. And I wanted to ask how first of all, how secure are consumers? And then secondly, how can banks ease those concerns around security? Because it seems like something that's consistently coming up and up. And I don't know if it's a reaction to the market or if it's,
Yeah, so in terms of those, in terms of security concerns, you're right in saying security and breaches and fraud itself has been quite a bit of a hot topic, I think, in the media. We've seen a number of news articles relating to the increased level of fraud occurring in people's online banking. But essentially, what has caused that is the sudden influx of new to digital or new to mobile users. Due to a whole lockdown restriction, we saw a number of these consumers who may not have used digital in the past being forced onto these digital channels, and they're maybe a little bit less, what would be the word? It's all, they're not quite as familiar. They're a little bit more easy to maybe fool. And I think a lot of the fraudsters have seen that as being a more of an easier target. They've been targeting these individuals, and that's what has essentially caused that sharp rise. I think over time, we saw a sharp increase from the whole lockdown. Over time, I think mobile banking will continue to rise, but at some point it may sort of slow down a little bit in terms of that transition to mobile. And I think over time, as people become more familiar with mobile banking, it will become more difficult for fraudsters to fool these people. In terms of what banks can do, not just in terms of stopping it, but also just in terms of reassuring consumers, I think fraud alerts is great. Again, as mentioned, our whole idea of just reassuring them that their money is safe, that that there's someone there to contact and to assist them if something goes wrong. I think as well the whole idea of, we see when there is a problem, when something does go wrong, consumers instantly want to go into branch to seek help. So another concern around security is the whole idea that if something was to go wrong, if something bad was to happen, if they can't go into branch, who do they contact? How can they get in contact with someone to help resolve that problem? So again, access to information, but also just having those sort of like having the channel to speak with a member of staff via digital is also going to be very important. So sort of live chat services, the video chat as well. So just reassuring them that if anything was to go wrong, their money will be safe, and there are a team there to help support them and help give them the support they need to resolve the problem.
Thank you very much, Luke, for the very interesting conversation and the insights. Thank you. It was really informative. We've covered as many questions as we could today. Apologies, we're running out of time, but all of these insights that Luke has shared with us and much more can be found in our Global Digital Banking study. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. My contact details are being displayed on the screen right now. Before I wrap up, I'd like to thank you all once again for joining us and making this webinar possible, for your interactive questions. Please don't forget, you'll soon be receiving an email from us with the recording, which you'll have access to indefinitely. So feel free to watch the recording, share it, and also feel free to reach out again to let us know if you have any questions or feedback. We'd really appreciate that. We look forward to igniting some great conversations in the coming weeks. Thanks again for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you on the webinar. And Luke, thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.